California runs on a gasoline supply chain that operates at the edge of failure. Arizona depends on refineries that the state government is systematically shutting down. When fuel shortages spread across state lines, the immediate crisis reveals a deeper structural problem. With his national ambitions growing, this crisis could not come at a worse time for Gavin Newsom. Multiple reports suggest California faces the closure of several major refineries over the next few years. The immediate narrative focuses on environmental regulations and climate goals. The visible story is straightforward. Aging facilities become too expensive to operate under new environmental standards imposed by Sacramento. Companies exit rather than invest in costly upgrades, but this surface explanation misses the underlying mechanism that drives these decisions. Arizona consumes roughly 1/3 of its gasoline from California refineries. Nevada relies on California for nearly all its fuel supply. These states didn't choose this dependency. Geographic constraints and specialized fuel formulations created it. The fuel that flows from California requires specific refining equipment that few facilities outside the state possess. Over the past few decades, the California administration implemented unique gasoline formulation requirements designed to reduce emissions. This created what energy analysts call an energy island. The specialized blend cannot be easily replaced by fuel from other regions. When refineries close, replacement capacity doesn't automatically emerge elsewhere. The regulatory environment that created the island effect now threatens the supply that sustains it. The economics reveal the pressure points. Refinery operations require massive capital investment to meet changing environmental standards. Compliance costs accumulate across multiple regulatory frameworks. Maintenance requirements become more restrictive. Inventory mandates increase operating expenses. The combination creates financial pressure that pushes facilities toward closure rather than modernization. That's where the incentives shift. Refinery operators face a choice between substantial investment in uncertain regulatory environments or exit strategies that preserve capital. The rational economic response becomes facility closure. This individual company logic produces systemic consequences across the region that now directly threaten the governor's political position. Arizona and Nevada governors recently sent joint communications to the California government expressing concern about fuel supply stability. The correspondence highlighted the interstate nature of what appears to be California's internal energy policy. State boundaries don't contain the economic effects of refinery closures. Pipeline networks and distribution systems connect regional markets in ways that make isolated energy policies impossible. This is the part most discussions skip. The refineries closing aren't just California infrastructure. They're regional infrastructure supporting multiple state economies. But the regulatory decisions affecting their operations occur within one state's political framework. The mismatch between regulatory authority and economic impact zones creates coordination problems that have now become a political crisis for Sacramento. A growing pattern emerges when examining similar situations in other regions. Energy infrastructure operates as a system, but regulatory oversight fragments across jurisdictions. Individual states pursue environmental goals that produce consequences in neighboring areas. The affected states possess limited influence over policies that directly impact their energy security and economic stability. The fuel shortage scenarios extend beyond gasoline availability. Transportation costs for goods moving through affected regions increase when fuel prices spike. Agricultural operations in Arizona face higher input costs. Tourism industries in both states experience elevated operational expenses. The ripple effects compound through sectors that seem unrelated to refinery operations, creating a growing base of political opposition to the current leadership's policies. And that changes the balance. What begins as environmental regulation becomes economic pressure that reshapes entire regional supply chains. The costs don't remain contained within California's borders. They distribute across interstate commerce networks that rely on stable fuel pricing and availability. For Newsom, this represents a political problem that extends beyond his state electoral base. Recent years have shown how quickly fuel supply disruptions translate into broader economic effects. Pipeline shutdowns lasting weeks create price volatility that persists for months. Refinery maintenance extending beyond scheduled timeframes produces immediate cost increases at retail level. The system operates with minimal buffer capacity that leaves little room for supply interruptions. Military installations in both states add another dimension to supply considerations. Air Force bases and other defense facilities require reliable fuel access for operational readiness. Supply disruptions that affect civilian markets also impact military logistics networks. National security considerations intersect with state-level energy policy in ways that complicate the decision-making framework and increase federal pressure on the state government. This is where the system reveals itself. Energy infrastructure serves multiple functions simultaneously. It supports civilian transportation, commercial logistics, agricultural operations, and defense requirements. When one component of this system faces pressure, the effects cascade through all connected networks. The interdependencies make isolated policy changes impossible to contain, creating political vulnerabilities that transcend partisan lines. The replacement strategies currently under consideration by the California administration involve importing fuel from more distant sources. This increases transportation costs and introduces additional supply chain vulnerabilities. Weather events affecting shipping routes, geopolitical tensions impacting international suppliers, currency fluctuations, changing import economics. The shift from regional to international supply chains multiplies risk factors that could explode politically at any moment. Neighboring states develop their own response mechanisms. Pipeline projects to access alternative supply sources, strategic fuel reserve programs to buffer against shortages. But these adaptations require time to implement and capital to finance. The transition period leaves regions exposed to supply disruptions and price volatility that translate into growing political pressure against Sacramento. The timeline creates particular pressure for the governor. Refinery closures occur on corporate schedules, driven by financial considerations. Replacement infrastructure develops on regulatory timelines involving environmental reviews and permitting processes. The gap between closure and replacement creates periods of supply vulnerability that affect millions of consumers across multiple states, all potentially blaming California leadership. Two scenarios emerge from this trajectory. The first involves successful adaptation, where alternative supply sources fill the gap left by closed refineries. New pipeline infrastructure connects Arizona and Nevada to fuel supplies from Texas or Utah. Import facilities in California accommodate increased seaborne fuel shipments. The transition occurs with minimal long-term disruption to regional fuel markets, allowing Newsom to declare victory over the energy transition. The alternative scenario involves persistent supply constraints and elevated fuel costs across the Southwest. Import capacity fails to fully compensate for lost refinery output. Pipeline projects face regulatory delays or financing difficulties. The region experiences recurring fuel shortages during peak demand periods. Businesses relocate operations to areas with more stable energy costs. The economic consequences extend beyond transportation fuel into broader regional competitiveness, creating a political failure narrative that could define the current government's legacy. The second scenario carries devastating implications for future political ambitions. Companies making location decisions factor energy costs and supply reliability into their calculations. Persistent fuel price premiums create competitive disadvantages for businesses operating in affected areas. The gradual effects accumulate into broader patterns of economic migration and investment flows that become political ammunition for opponents. Both scenarios assume current policy frameworks remain stable. But energy supply crises often produce political pressure for policy modifications. Emergency measures to expedite infrastructure projects, temporary exemptions from environmental regulations, interstate compacts to coordinate energy policies across state boundaries. The crisis response can reshape regulatory approaches in ways that extend beyond immediate fuel supply concerns and directly into the territory of political survival. Financial markets reflect these uncertainties through energy commodity pricing and regional economic indicators. Fuel futures for West Coast delivery, trade at premiums reflecting supply risk. Commercial real estate values in affected areas adjust to account for elevated operating costs. Transportation companies modify route planning and service pricing to accommodate fuel cost volatility. Every market movement serves as a political thermometer of confidence in the current administration's ability to manage the crisis. This situation demonstrates how local policy decisions interact with regional economic systems. Environmental regulations designed to address air quality concerns produce energy supply consequences that cross state boundaries. The complexity arises from mismatched scales between regulatory authority and economic impact zones. For a politician with national ambitions, this dynamic creates vulnerabilities that opponents can exploit in future campaigns. Similar patterns appear in other policy areas where state decisions produce interstate consequences. Water allocation agreements affecting agricultural productivity, transportation infrastructure investments influencing freight logistics, economic development incentives creating competitive pressures between neighboring jurisdictions. The energy supply situation represents one example of broader coordination challenges in federal systems that test the political viability of individual leaders. The immediate indicators to monitor include fuel price differentials between California and neighboring regions, pipeline utilization rates for alternative supply routes, permit applications for new energy infrastructure projects, corporate announcements regarding facility, locations, and investment decisions, approval ratings in affected states. These metrics provide early signals about how the supply transition develops and whether adaptive mechanisms prove adequate to sustain the desired political narrative. The broader question involves how regional economic integration intersects with environmental policy implementation in a political system where accountability transcends geographic boundaries. States pursuing aggressive climate goals while maintaining economic competitiveness. Interstate cooperation on infrastructure projects spanning multiple jurisdictions, federal coordination mechanisms for addressing energy supply disruptions with national security implications. The current situation tests these governance systems under stress conditions that reveal their operational limitations and adaptive capacity, defining the contours of what is politically possible for individual leaders. And if this crisis continues, it won't just define California's energy future, it could end Gavin Newsom's political one.